that has been conceived as a rather small, I have to say, small workshop. The idea is to have a real discussion about issues concerning the free trade agreement with the United States in the first session, and then to try to expand the idea of the transatlantic relationship to the southern rim, so as to put it, so as to build up a sort of pan-Atlantic perspective, which is not an easy idea to be implemented. So the idea was we start with a double-track conversation, and that has been made possible by the contribution of Istituto Affari Internazionali, IAI. I see here the chairman, Stefano Silvestri, many other young fellows. They, by the way, Riccardo Alcaro and Emiliano Alessandri from IAI and German Marshall Fund of the United States wrote a fascinating paper. You'll find it on your desk. Then we had the contribution of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Thank you very much. Here we have Ian Lesser. Thank you, Ian, who was also able to bring to Rome Peter Chase, who is Vice President of the US Chamber of Commerce. Thank you very much indeed. It was a late invitation, to be honest, and you are very, very, very kind to be today with us. Ciao Fabrizio. Please, where is it your... Dov'è il tuo? Perché là? No, vieni qua, scusa Fabrizio. Spostiamo, I'm sorry.
I follow orders.
No, there has been a mistake between the... And then la Compagnia di San Paolo as a strategic partner, normally to the GMF, but also to IAI, and thirdly to the Foreign Affairs Ministry. So thank you again. A few minutes more waiting for Minister Terzi. And Minister Amram, you are already here, but I don't want that you open up without our minister. I would consider that unkind also to you. So really just a couple of minutes more. I mean, this exercise is just a beginning. It's very timely. I don't know whether you all saw, but I'm sure of that, the talk that Joe Biden gave in Munich at the Verkunde. There was the idea precisely of this kind of deal between the United States and Europe, that is a new free trade agreement. Obviously, the devil is in the details. It's not easy at all. We have a lot of non-tariff barriers to be overcome. We will discuss part of them today. But I think that the general idea is very interesting for all of us. So we will try to deal with these issues in a productive way. So thanking you again and waiting a couple of minutes more, then we will start. Riccardo, who is Riccardo Alcaro? Where is? Why don't you say a few introductory words about your paper? 3 minutes. The main evidence you try to make in your paper, that could be helpful for the follow-up discussion. Please.
So about the idea of starting conceptualizing the wider Atlantic as one single mega region. Actually, this was not the intent of the paper. The paper was just meant to provide an initial mapping, in geopolitical terms mostly, of the wider Atlantic as a space which, why not still a unitary space, still is. We use the metaphor of a crowded crossing points, meaning that North Atlantic actors are not only increasingly intensifying the economic and trade relations with each other, but also with what was once perceived as sort of geographic appendix of Europe and North America. These appendixes are definitely not any longer to be considered as such. They were probably never to be considered as such, but now there is little doubt that the South Atlantic is rising on both its halves. So both Latin America and Africa are increasingly dynamic in economic terms, but also in particular certain states called rising economies or rising power also in political terms. So the idea of the paper was to start conceptualizing the Atlantic as a place where, as a mega space where trade, people move ever more intensely, ever more dynamically, and these create some challenges of both international and transnational nature that are basically the same or very similar for all the Atlantic Basin players, and these warrants a certain interaction or a certain level of cooperation, which we now do not have yet, but that we should start considering having. In particular, trade and investment are areas which, as a rule, they are traditionally the most dynamic in international relations. So trade has increased considerably along all trajectories. So North America, Europe, North America, Latin America, North America, Africa, Africa, Europe, Latin America, considerably in the last 10 years. And what is really striking is that trade has increased more or less uniformly along all these trajectories. So not only do we have the Europeans and Americans actually having increased their bilateral trade, but they have also increased their trade with Africa and with Latin America, and this is another point which is definitely worth attention. Africa and Latin America have increased their trade relationship. Actually, in the first decade of the new millennium, the increase rate of Latin America or South Atlantic trade was over 400%. So this is certainly an area which is particularly dynamic and which warrants a certain level of regulation or a certain level of cooperation. Then we have, of course, within the economic sphere, certain areas which have the potential to become distinctive feature of the Atlantic Basin, and energy in particular is the one on which we focus in the paper, because the wider Atlantic space is, in energy terms, a quite interesting place.
Thank you very much. Riccardo, we have the two ministers together, and I give them the floor immediately. Giulio, this is the workshop, as you know.
Thank you, Mr. Minister Terzi. Thank you, Marta. I think I'm surprised I was going to speak second to listen what Minister Terzi will say. But let me, first of all, thank you very much for organizing this workshop. I think it is very timely today to talk about the Atlantic. And this shows that Italy, the Foreign Minister of Italy, understands the strategic importance of the Atlantic today in a very complex and difficult situation in the region, economic and financial difficulties in the north of Europe, in the southern Mediterranean transitions, democratic transitions, and also difficulties also in Africa as far as peace building and peacekeeping. Let me answer one question and ask me one question, why I'm here today. I'm here because I'm a fan of Italy first, and I was here for another meeting, but I think also I'm here just to recall 3 points. The first point is that to recall that in 1777, Morocco was the first country to recognize the independence of America and to conclude a peace, an MFN, a most favored nation, trade and maritime protection. It was the first treaty that was ratified by the Congress and the longest lasting agreement ever concluded by the USA. The second point is that because in Morocco, in 2009, launched an initiative in the Atlantic space, especially within the African perspective, as a step forward towards a new paradigms of geopolitical governance. The view and the objective of this initiative was to promote, of course, security, stability, because we were facing in our region security threats in the Gulf of Guinea, I will talk about later on, but also to promote shared prosperity through, I think, and this is the objective also of today's meeting, innovative approaches and tools. The third element why I'm here is because Morocco is linked with the EU, with the USA and some African countries by FTAs, because we made the choice of free trade agreements, and I think it is the most important today for Italy, for our other partners, the necessity to promote trade and to promote growth to innovative approaches and tools. So Morocco, so these examples are here to bring the evidence that Morocco believes strongly in the pertinence of the Atlantic vision, and especially in this context today, context of crisis both in America and in Europe, and perspectives of growth in the Latin America and in Africa. Today, I am happy to see around the table that this vision is shared by important players, by think tanks, by politicians, and a strong consensus emerged during the last meeting we organized in Morocco and Sgherat around these points. First, there is today an urgent need to promote strategic relations based on shared values. Shared values, democracy, of human rights, but also common objectives as far as promotion of growth, job creation, and innovative approaches to face these common threats and challenges. I'm not going to talk about the threats, because today we are facing threats, security threats, but also other threats. My second point is that these approaches should be based on targeting top priorities. And today, I think the priorities in our region, in the Atlantic, whether it is Latin America or Africa, is food and energy security, movement of persons, shared knowledge, as examples of our priorities that we should tackle. Of course, and implementing these priorities on a new governance. I think in your paper that was presented earlier this morning, and there is this idea of new governance patterns focused on the human dimension of development. because it is important to solve the security issues through border controls, fight against terrorism, but also if we don't have a doses of development and human development, essentially, we cannot really face this alone, these challenges. This should be done in partnership, should be done within a collective approach, and we believe in Morocco, that these strategies are two faces of the same coin. Economic development, political development, but also fight against security. Of course, we should not create new bureaucracies to service these common objectives. I think we have the necessary tools in the region, in Africa, in Europe, that can serve this objective. We also need to do our own homework in our region as far as regional integration in the Maghreb, in West Africa, in Latin America. In fact, in Latin America, a lot of progress has been done, Mercosur, Comunidad Andina, but a lot of integration should be done in our region, Africa, essentially, and in the Maghreb. So no need to create new bureaucracies. We need to have innovative means, relying on networks, taking advantage of existing multilateral institutions. As I was saying earlier, and this is my fourth point, the economic crisis in Europe, the US, and other regions is a sound opportunity. It is a sound opportunity to seize. While in Latin America and Africa, countries are growing economically by 6, 7, 5%. It's important, and it is also an opportunity for business people in Europe to take this opportunity. Because at the end of the day, the most important is how to make money. You have to talk business first, It's important. That's why this strategic vision should ally not only security, development, but also how to create the necessary tools to make business. And the dynamics that have been shown today by African, Latin American, and Latin American countries is, I think, a source of mutual learning, common remedies, and significant assets to fight against unemployment and to create growth. My fifth point, I think the recent development in the Sahel, Mali, the insecurity in the Gulf of Guinea, it is the Atlantic, because we want to avoid, again, as Morocco, when we talk this initiative, we want to avoid any Somalization of the Gulf of Guinea, because today we are witnessing the same elements in the Gulf of Guinea. Instability in Guinea-Bissau, growing insecurity, piracy, and connection between jihadist and terrorist networks with drug trafficking. I think this threat should help us and should lead us to imagine new tools how to find this insecurity, this threat, through, of course, a holistic approach and a collective endeavor. And I think this kind of gathering offers us the opportunity to think and to work together. And we believe that we should continue to work together. Let me, I don't want to speak more, but I want to conclude by making a link between yesterday's meeting on the reform of the Security Council. I don't think it is a coincidence. I think it is very timely today that we link the two approaches, because we need to fight peace. We need to fight terror through peace and stability with the reform of the Security Council. And I think yesterday we had a very interesting debate, and today by promoting this zone of shared prosperity. Italy is in Europe. Italy is a key actor in the Mediterranean. Italy is also a key actor in the neighborhood policy. I think you have been working very hard to give to the Mediterranean a priority, but these two exercises are not in contradiction. They are complementary. And I think I'm very happy to notice the presence today of Christian Lefleur, with whom I negotiated the advanced set of Moroccan to the European Union and the Union for the Mediterranean, to see that Europe today is here. that Europe can accompany, because I think the instruments we have in Europe, Cathy is not here to speak about the three MMs, money, mobility, and market, but I think we need this kind of tools, even in the Atlantic, to create growth and to respond to the expectations of young generation in our region, and Atlantic, Africa. You know, we need to work to find something coherent between your priorities and Europe, and I'm happy to see that you are taking the lead today for this transatlantic vision. Of course, since the Second World War, there was a transatlantic link between Europe and North America, but today I think Atlantic is an opportunity for Latin American countries, for African countries looking at the Atlantic shore, for food security, for energy. Of course, we have to face the competition. We're facing competition of other actors. China today is very present in Africa. I think it's important to see. And I think that part of the solution relies in the way how you tackle this issue. Because at the end of the day, what we need here is more dialogue, what we are doing here, more solidarity, and more cooperation in order to face these common challenges and to work together for a zone of peace and shared prosperity. Thank you very much for organizing this meeting.
Okay.
Vada solo,
I was asking Marta the authorization to press the button and take the floor. Thank you very much, Marta, for organizing this very, very impressive gathering of personalities who have, from many angles, such an important knowledge of the transatlantic perspective in its wider and more deep format, as you like to wish, and as it is really the purpose of this meeting, the subject that we are facing. Minister Amrani Dia-Joseph, let me say how pleased I am of what you just said and the eloquence of your exposition. Because, first of all, you gave a historical perspective to the relationship between Morocco and the Atlantic world, the reference really to the recognition, to the establishment of a relationship between Morocco and the United States is very important to remind the depth of history in that sense in the transatlantic relations, which is always very, very important to remind in terms of value that you also expressed. But let me say the many things that you mentioned, that you underlined, could have been taken by me as Foreign Minister of Italy exactly word by word. And especially because, just to give an example of the agenda of the Foreign Ministry over the last 24 hours, we have been leading, together with a Spanish friend, an important meeting of the Reform of Security Council, which is an old story, but is getting into a new dimension of governance with the difficulties that the Security Council is facing, the stalemate, especially on a couple of crises, although there has been in Sahel crisis another demonstration of efficiency, but there are many other things which need desperately to be improved. And we are on the same side for that. So this morning at Cecchignola, I attended a meeting of the North Atlantic Association, a 58th anniversary of the association, where, in fact, maybe the North Atlantic, but was very much in question, the discussion, the debate on the future, where we are heading in terms of our collective security. And later on, an important discussion on the condition of women, a certain aspect of the condition of women in Africa. And therefore, that means that transatlantic and African issues and European, North American, South American are very much in our mind. And that's why our countries, name it the Mediterranean neighborhood policy for the European Union, but again, the need to revitalize the Mediterranean dialogue of NATO and the Istanbul process of NATO, and thinks these are common undertakings not only in our region, but in good part of the world, which is so determinant for the international community. So my warmest thanks also to the German Marshall Fund of the United States, the Istituto Affari Internazionali, the Compagnia di San Paolo for supporting this initiative so eminently. The shift of power from the West to the rest is a well-known concept. So Foreign Affairs was talking about this just a couple of issues ago. The emergence of new actors is redefining a long-established balance among powers. That's a common understanding. And the Western economies, the Western economic crisis has only magnified this trend. However, I strongly believe that the West can maintain confidence in itself, thanks to deeper and wider Atlantic bonds. And perhaps the challenge of strengthening these bonds is the main way of answering to those who are inclined to that declinist theory of the Western civilization and Western security. It will not happen, but it will never happen, especially in the long term, if we are able to work on these bonds, to make them more vital and dynamic. And that's why deepening the Atlantic could also boost our economies, and especially boosting our economies also increase our security. Therefore, deepening the Atlantic, but also widening the Euro-American partnership to Latin America and Africa. Deepening the Atlantic means closeness, especially between Europe and the United States, as we have traditionally seen this dimension, through common values which are not exclusive, but are particularly felt in foreign policy of the two continents: democracy, human rights, rule of law, and free market. There is no such integrated economy in the world as the transatlantic one. No higher level of integration is around. And figures tell the truth. The US and the EU economies account together for half the world GDP and for a third of world trade flows. These are EU Commission's data. Total US investment in the EU is 3 times higher than all of Asia. The EU investment in the US is around 8 times the amount of EU investment in India and China together. The US and the European Union are still playing a leading role, still playing a very, very big sense, a leading role in security matters. Transatlantic partners are on the front line, in fact, in all major world crises. It is true that we are witnessing a shift of balance in world defense spending, because it is true. Over the next few years, the US share could fall from 50% to 39%. The European one also could fall, marginally perhaps, but from 16 to 15%, being at a very lower level already, while the military spending of the rising powers, especially the BRICS, is expected to grow by 150% in the same period. However, the combined military budget of the US, the European countries, and other NATO partners, it's still a huge proportion of the global total. It is still 70% of total defense expenditures. So, despite much rhetoric to the contrary, also the numbers do not justify the declinist theories. But the current economic trend and budgetary constraints show the urgent need for new strategies. Even more essential, a strategy which should always be clear in the mind of policymakers, but it is an element of necessity whenever we face scarcity of money. I would like, as a general remarks, to mention three aspects. The first one pertains to the economic strategy. The EU and the US enjoy the most integrated economic relationship in the world, as I've already said, but they can generate much more trade and much more investment. According to a study by the European Commission, a transatlantic free trade area will expand GDP on both shores of the Atlantic by 163 billion euros, increasing trade by 50%, adding 7 million new jobs to the American and European work market. 163 billion euros as an added figure in GDP is a figure given by the Commission. I have read different analyses even higher, between 200 and 250 million. The deal, as the negotiators who are starting their work, the intense debate both in Washington and Brussels and in the European capital on this, this is a common conviction, I believe, but I would be very much interested in hearing the voice of the European representative, not much better than I do. There's a common perception that the deal should be done on one tank of gas. That's to say, don't count on pit stops to refuel or to change the wheels, to change the tires, because the Doha round is too much of a negative experience after 12 years of difficulties and now a stalemate where we are in. And there is a resurgence of it's not only, not as much a fashion, but it is a question of real life and necessity to count always more on regional free trade agreements. That's something which is developing around the world, and I think, and I think that in the absence of a global trade negotiation, this is the second best that we can have, and it has to be pursued. It has to be pursued. The European Union is negotiating with Canada also a free trade agreement at an advanced stage, and tomorrow a ministerial session could reach some further substantial progress. More jobs, more opportunities for small and innovative businesses, more prosperity would greatly benefit Western middle classes. It could be the best response to the challenges of globalization. As Charles Kupchan said, hard times can stoke protectionism and isolationism, but globalization is here to stay, and retreat is not an option. Growth through trade and liberalization is a reliable alternative to traditional deficit spending measures. But to succeed, we must be cohesive. Cohesiveness is an absolute necessity. Strength can only be found together, and we hope that the US and the European Union will finally agree on the opening of negotiations for the transatlantic free trade agreement. On the other hand, success can also promote cohesion within the European Union. The Economist was saying over the last few days, British magazine, that now that Britain is talking of holding a referendum on its EU membership, a successful agreement between the EU and America could demonstrate that the British do better bargaining only through the EU and not alone. Second aspect I'd like to mention, the security strategy. Scarcity of resources is an opportunity to better develop our security strategy. It is high time to promote efficiency, rationalization, division of labor within the transatlantic community. Smart defense and cooperation can generate savings, economies of scale, and added value. And this was exactly the message given by the Chicago's NATO summit last April. We Europeans can no longer be security consumers under US protection and responsibility. The US has updated its security posture. The new American defense strategy is leaning towards a streamlined military instrument. And Italy is pushing hard for more Europe also in defense, and especially in defense, in order to strengthen the overall Euro-Atlantic security and make Europe a true security provider. As the third point, let me mention the energy market. There is much scope to deepen transatlantic cooperation, especially in this field. Our geography, resources, our energy mix raise different expectations. Europe heavily depends on gas imports. The US, thanks to the shale gas, is reaching self-sufficiency. But Europe and America are inspired by the same principles. We both believe in open, transparent, competitive, and sustainable global energy markets. And I'm sure that in the framework of the US-EU energy dialogue, we will continue to enhance these principles, reaching concrete outcomes in the Energy Council, which is already working with some positive effect, in my opinion. Finally, the second aspect, on which I will quite short, widening the Atlantic, because Marta is glancing at
Yes.
me in a worried way. Widening means Africa and Latin America especially, two continents where economies are catching up fast and with a new generation of democratic leaders, a continent which is showing a very positive growth of GDP, and not only of GDP, but education, technology, science. We must therefore work to establish a stable and long partnership between Europe and those regions, since Europe and Latin America and Africa stand side by side in many fields. TAFTA, the Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement, can be a model not only for North America, but also for South America. And the connection, the interaction between Latin America and Africa were very well explained by Minister Amrani. But just let's think about two examples. The narcos in the Gulf of Guinea, coming from Colombia, have deeply affected the situation in Mali, mixing with the terrorist and insurgency forces. And this is something which will not go away. It must be addressed in a global dimension, and with a closer partnership and closer cooperation with Latin American and African countries together with the European Union. And of course, think again as a specific country. Marta has visited recently Colombia, which is increasing, cooperating with Western African countries exactly in this fight. I stop here because otherwise she cuts my microphone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Thank you, Giulio. A very good introduction. I immediately give the floor to Robin Niblet, who is the director of Chatham House, and who is so kind to chair the first session on the free trade, the possibility of establishing a free trade area between Europe and the US. Thank you, Robin. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Marta. Thank you for the invitation, and a great pleasure to be able to be here and to moderate the first half of this two-sided conversation about this much, not just deeper, but wider Atlantic. As you've seen in this first session, we're going to focus on the second Obama administration and European Union and the potential for building a deeper, more comprehensive trade and investment relationship across the Atlantic. We have a limited amount of time and a lot of very distinguished speakers to speak. As you can see from the program here, we'll be starting off with some introductory remarks from Fabrizio Saccomanni, the Director General of the Bank of Italy, I think known to everyone here very well, and therefore not needing of any further introduction by me, but except to say that I think not only his role in Europe, but on the many international organizations, the Bank of International Settlements, etc., is playing a critical role in the EU's economic stability and potential growth. We will then be turning to 5 panelists, and just to remind all of you here, although we have a little over an hour, we do want to try, if at all possible, to have a conversation around the table and to try and get some remarks in by everyone. So as I've warned already the person closest to me, Lorenzo Binismachi, and as the organizers of this conference have suggested, we will try to keep everyone just to 5 or 6 minutes on the panel of introductory remarks. And I will introduce each of them, I think, in a minute. But I think the topic that we have at hand here, one which I think has been very well described by Riccardo Alcaro and Emiliano Alessandri in their paper, about the opportunity that exists right now to do, as they said, a deficit-free stimulus to the transatlantic economy is probably one of the most exciting opportunities we've had for a long time in the transatlantic relationship to push growth and give opportunities for jobs in the near term. This surely is the biggest challenge we face today, is not growth, but can we get growth now and not in 5 or 6 years' time. Before I introduce the panel, let me first give the opportunity to Fabrizio Saccomanni to do some introductory remarks, set the scene for this opening panel, and then I will introduce our panelists and let them know in what order they will be speaking. But first of all, Mr. Saccomanni, if I could turn to you, we look forward to your opening remarks, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to have been invited here to this conference. I remember that during the sort of financial crisis at the beginning, there was a joint project by Bruegel, a think tank in Europe, and the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and we put together some essays on transatlantic crisis management. And I remember that the American contribution to the title of this book was to put an ocean apart, to which we managed to add a question mark as a European contribution. Now, because at that time, I think the mood about transatlantic cooperation was quite different. I remember Robert Kagan wrote that Europe and the United States, we did not belong even to the same planet, and that we would never understand each other on anything. And so, happily, this is changed, and I'm very glad that I understand some quiet and perhaps becoming not so quiet shortly. Diplomacy is going on to revive the transatlantic discussion on trade. I think I don't have to give many figures. I think both in the paper that was prepared as an introduction by Alcaro and Alessandri, there were a number of important data, and also the minister himself has provided strong indication. I think, frankly, I believe that the case for a transatlantic free trade area is probably stronger now than it ever was. I think the reasons are that the world is still fighting with a prolonged recession, and liberalization of trade could certainly provide a boost to the economy. And I think there is perhaps the European crisis has drawn attention by all our friends across the Atlantic and elsewhere on the urgency perhaps to revive stronger form of cooperation. And I think this time could be different from other episodes in which transatlantic cooperation in the past has been attempted without achieving much success. So I will probably only ask a few questions to introduce the panel discussion. I think the first question would be, can we really expect large benefits from a free trade area, transatlantic free trade area? Because the trade and investment between the two areas is already quite deep, and so I'm aware of the studies that have been quoted, but the key issue would be not to concentrate on trade alone, but also to direct investment and on the services area, because this is where I think greater benefit could be achieved. Is the European Union, another question, is going to benefit from a zero tariff agreement? Again, my own answer would be yes, but it depends on certain sectors, because in certain areas I think the present tariffs are higher in Europe than in the United States, and vice versa. So there would be a clear difference, but certainly a combined positive case can be made. Then I think if one thinks what are the key obstacles to the process in this area, is that we need to look not only to tariff barriers but also to non-tariff measures, and there is a host of these which obviously have to be addressed that go quite beyond the sort of the typical barriers at the border. These are barriers that come from regulatory differences among countries, and safety, health standards, environmental protection, data treatment, privacy protection, industrial patents, and so forth. So there is indeed a very broad area in which there is a need to work. Then another key question is whether a transatlantic free trade area would be sort of damaging the multilateral trade system or not. Again, my own answer is that is not the case, because certainly we believe that the trade creation impact of this big transatlantic area would be bigger than the trade diversion impact, and so the net impact will still be positive, but it is essential that this trade agreement is open to all countries, and certainly the indication that the agreement should be open to Latin American countries, to African countries, is certainly a crucial aspect here. So everything seems to be fine. Well, I must say that there are key obstacles, and the trade negotiations are always moving very slowly, and this is, even if we start discussing this in earnest at an early stage, it is not realistic to imagine that you would have an immediate impact on actual trade flows and measures that could revive growth. So I think the title of this session is Betting on Trade. Yes, certainly, let's bet on trade, but let's not forget the macroeconomic setting. And the macroeconomic setting, I'm a macroeconomist myself, is very important, because, as I said, we're still in a situation of economic recession, and we see, unfortunately, that the risk for policies that are not really favorable to the opening of trade and liberalization are indeed taking strength. I think both in the United States and Japan there are risks that require the policy adjustments in the fiscal area, in the public debt management area, will be delayed for short-term reasons, and that instead there would be a tendency to follow policies that lead to a depreciation of the exchange rate, and of course, Europe is erring, if anything, on the other side. Certainly, we are taking fiscal consolidation and budget deficit very seriously, and we don't target the exchange rate. So there is the risk that Europe becomes the Eurozone, and the Euro become an area of what one may call the appreciating currency of last resort. Everybody wants to devalue compared to what, and the euro is the only currency that doesn't seem to mind very much about the exchange rate. But of course, there are limits to that. So I think the need for fiscal readjustment in the United States and Japan is important, and that doesn't mean that it would have an immediate negative impact on the world economy, because it can be sort of phased appropriately and structured in such a way as to minimize the short-term impact. But at the same time, the longer the action is delayed, the more skeptical the markets will become, and the stronger would be the corrective measures that will be required later on. Also, I think from a macroeconomic point of view, we are still in a period of very strong monetary expansion all over the world, and eventually this monetary expansion will have to be will have to be reabsorbed. That certainly might create problems, but the danger is that in this period of monetary relaxation, there will be less urgency to address structural problems, and again the risk of relying on excessive liquidity to postpone adjustment and corrective measures. And again, from a global point of view, this tendency, which is mostly taking place in the industrialized countries, again gives sources to concern in the main emerging areas, where these monetary policy easing are considered to be putting an undue pressure on the exchange rates of countries, particularly in Latin America, but also in Asia. And so there is then a tendency to embark on restrictive policies, capital restrictions, which normally are also a form of protectionism, not on the trade area, but on closely related areas. So I think the danger that we willingly or unwillingly sort of slide into this psychology of currency wars needs to be addressed very closely and with urgency, because while the trade negotiation to liberalize and opening up may take some time, the trade wars or the currency wars may start to have an impact much sooner. So again, there is a need within this idea of a Euro-American effort. Perhaps trade is an important item, but I think monetary and financial relationships, particularly within the G7 and the G20, needs to be taken more seriously. I mean, so far the efforts of the G20 to bring about a consistent set of macroeconomic policies that would help reducing world payments imbalances and therefore restore a better climate for trade liberalization and opening up of commerce is in danger. So I think there is a strong need for this revived partnership of Euro-Atlantic nature to take the initiative within the existing forums, not only of trade negotiation, but also of policy cooperation. I think that's more than enough to keep the discussion going, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saccomanni. Thank you very much for setting the tone, for laying out, as you said, a number of the potential benefits that exist in this type of agreement, but reminding us, I think very importantly, of the context in which this is taking place, the political and macroeconomic context, and the kind of risk, as you described them, of beggar thy neighbor policies running in parallel to this optimistic call for market opening across the Atlantic. Let me now quickly just introduce our five panelists. We have Lorenzo Binismaghi, I think known to everyone here, therefore not needing of much introduction given his former role on the European Central Bank, but now a senior visiting fellow at EI, a senior scholar at Harvard University, chairman of SNAM. Lorenzo, I'll let you in a minute kick off as first. I will take second so that we can mix our host Italian participants with some of our guests. I'll take Peter Chase. Peter, just warning you, you'll go second. Peter is Vice President of Europe for the US Chamber of Commerce, but I think known to many of us here as somebody who did extremely important work in the US State Department on the US-EU relationship, having headed up the State Department's Office of EU Affairs and then having served as the DCM in Brussels at the US Embassy to the EU. Third, we will go to Fulvio Conti, the CEO of Enel, who's held many senior, especially positions on the finance side in business, in Italy in particular, having also served as CFO of Telecom Italia. Then I will go to Christian Leffler. Christian, to warn you, you're fourth, who is now Managing Director of the Americas at the European External Action Service, having spent a number of years working in senior positions in the European Commission, most recently as Deputy Director General for Development, Chef de Cabinet to Margot Wallström, and also in other external relations positions. We will then go last to Riccardo Monti, who's now the new president as of early in 2012 of the Istituto per il Commercio Estero, I think if I translate that right, external commerce institute promoting Italian business globally. And I think we have therefore a good mix of both people with business and private sector experience to be able to lead us through this discussion. I think Mr. Sacomani laid out some pretty important set of 4 questions, which I hope each of you will be able to turn to in your short 5 to 6 minute opening sets of comments, and I will give a chance to come back to you to add to those comments if you wish. But what sort of economic benefits do we expect? How do you get into this very difficult area of non-tariff barriers? Is it possible politically? What benefits does it lie there? What third country impacts might we have from these agreements? And to start off, if I may, with you, Lorenzo, what is the macroeconomic context from your perspective in which this whole potential process towards market opening and investment opening is going to take place? So, Lorenzo, please set the tone and example for us as our first panelist.
Yeah, I suppose in terms of timing also. Exactly. Yeah, so I'll try to be brief, and thank you for inviting me. I will focus on the macro issues. I think the key question that Fabrizio Sacomani also raised, which is linked to the reasons why we are in this crisis in Europe, is that also Europe started with free trade and ended up in a financial crisis 50 years later, because it's very difficult to conceive to have only trade as being integrated without then services, within then capital movements, without also linking monetary policies, and then maybe you have to realize that other things have to be linked, including fiscal policies. So looking in that perspective, are we starting with the right foot? And if we think about the crisis we are in on both sides of the Atlantic, we cannot omit from seeing that the solutions to the crisis are quite different and may have an impact on each other. There are basically 3 ways to address a debt overhang. One is to have restrictive fiscal policies for several years. The second one is to have inflation, or to have the public sector or the central bank absorb the risks that have been taken by the private sector. And the third is debt restructuring. Now, if you think about Europe and the US, you can see that the approach is quite different. Europe clearly has opted for the first solution as a first best, and the third solution if you can't make it. And there is really no room, even in the treaty, for the second solution, which is inflation. And if you look at the strategy, actually it has been quite successful for some countries. If you think about Germany, Germany has been able to adjust its budget quite successfully. But other countries have many more problems, as we know, to the point of the extreme of Greece, which has been forced to restructure its debt. And we know the consequences of this strategy, which has been deliberately chosen by Europeans. On the other side, you have the US, which has so far mainly adjusted through monetary policy and the Fed absorbing the risks. And there is no real medium-term fiscal adjustment. Now, these 2 different strategies have an impact, not only on their respective economy, but on the global economy, on the financial markets, and on each other, both in the short term and in the long run. And this is the fundamental question. Are these strategies compatible? Are they not going to lead to tensions in the financial markets and in trade relations? So that's a key issue you want to address if you think about liberalizing trade. Now, is it possible that these 2 major areas implement different strategies without impacting each other? Now, before coming to the issue of the impact on financial markets, it's clear that there are risks, and there are risks if these two strategies don't work out. So it is in the interest of the US that the European strategy works, and it is in the interest of the Euro area that the US strategy works. And we have seen this during Obama one in particular, with the US administration being very concerned about Europe being able to progress and to make the adjustment in time, because the impact on the US economy would have been devastating, and on financial markets as well. It is also in the Euro area interest that the US are successful and that growth picks up, so that this need for very accommodative policies is corrected. And as long as these policies are not successful, so in the short to medium term, the risks are that the impact of the policies on each other are rather negative than positive. And if you think about, I don't think that Fabrizio mentioned the word currency wars, but there is a risk that all the adjustment is on the financial markets and on the exchange rate. And this risk is a real one, in the sense that the exchange rate between the euro and the dollar is the only relative price which is left to adjust. And the reason is that other relative prices are not adjusting, in particular those of some emerging markets, in particular in Asia. So we are in the phase of starting some important discussion in the trade area, with some risks in the financial sector, and affecting a relative price which is very important for trade relations. And incidentally, this was one of the reasons why Europe moved to monetary union, in order to reduce exchange rate volatility. So can we move to further integration in the trade area without having some kind of agreement on ways to avoid excessive fluctuation of exchange rates between the dollar and the euro? And the key, in my view, is in the end the relationship with Asia and with China. If the US and if Europe think that they can address the issue of the exchange rate of the Chinese currency and all the Asians by themselves without a common agreement, then I think it is a lost cause. So the issue of trade integration requires also some broader agreement on how to manage financial and exchange rate relations with emerging markets, in particular China. And this is an issue we have been discussing for a long time, but have not been really successful. I mean, the various US administrations have taken different views. Europe maybe has not had a sufficiently strong institutional framework for having these issues discussed in a strong way. And so let me maybe close on this. I think it's probably right, it's not necessarily easier, but it's probably right to start from trade, but one has to be very careful not to go in a direction based on European experience also, where you realize that other things need to be integrated, and the political cost is so high that you may risk moving backwards. So trade integration is very positive if you don't move backwards, and in order not to move backwards, you need to move forward in other fields, in particular in the financial and monetary sphere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo, for, I thought, actually some very wise words to kick off this discussion, really connecting us to this macroeconomic context. I think a point you raised that hopefully we'll come back to as well is about timing. There is a concern that, in a way, the US is recovering at a different speed, that it went into the crisis perhaps 2 years earlier or 3 years earlier than Europe really did deeply, and therefore maybe coming out at a different speed of it as well. So there's not only this broader macroeconomic context that you provided in the context of currencies, but also in terms of timing, and we may have different policies happening at different stages, and that really Europe may be in a slightly weaker position going into this negotiation than the US is. Let me, having said that, turn to Peter Chase, and Peter, take advantage of your experience both inside government are now closely connected with the US private sector. Could you share with us your view of the context in which this negotiation is likely to be starting off in 6 or 7 minutes? Thank you.
Robin, I'll try to be very conscious of timing and do it in less than 5 if I can. When it hits 10 of, I will simply stop speaking and the next person can start. On timing, I think one of the things that needs to be stressed is we are on the eve of launching these negotiations. Mr. De Gucht, the trade minister, is in Washington now. He is going to be meeting with Mr. Froman really shortly. He's going to be going to the chamber and meeting with a number of American businesses. He then has dinner with Mr. Kirk and meetings tomorrow with Mr. Kirk. It is quite possible that the two of them will release the recommendations of the high-level working group tomorrow. If they do not release it tomorrow, I'm at a 95% probability that they will release it on Wednesday of next week, directly after the President's State of the Union. When these recommendations are released, recommending that we begin these negotiations, we will then have a few months of preparation, but we'll actually launch the talks in June, and then we will conclude them before the end of next year. Okay, now I have to explain all of that. But the point here is the timing is critical, and it is imminent. And this has a responsibility, I think, this brings the responsibility to many of us in this room. We're at this stage thanks, I think, to a lot of work that the German Marshall Fund has done in the United States, that the Atlantic Council has done in the United States, and many of the others who are participants here today. 3 years ago, there was not a chance in hell that such negotiations would be launched. I think over time, people have understood that this is not just important economically, not just as a way out of the crisis, but has a geostrategic significance as well. I would love to talk about that, but I'm with the US Chamber of Commerce. So I'm going to focus on the economics. The economic benefits, again, on question of timing, the economic benefits come in 4 stages. They come immediately in terms of the impact on the market as a sign of confidence and strength in Brussels and in Washington that we can do this. They come during the negotiations when businessmen start to make investments in anticipation of the results. They come once you conclude the negotiations and tariffs go down, and has an immense benefit on costs, not just between US-EU trade, but the competitiveness of our firms in a global context because we are so integrated. And then the 4th period is after, where first there will be an impact on productivity that is a lasting impact for both the US and the EU as we meet new competitive circumstances, and second, as we address regulatory issues. Because the benefits are so clear to me, I wonder why the hell we haven't started this sooner. The administration in particular, European leaders have called for these negotiations. The administration in Washington has been a little bit more reluctant. Seeing some of the concerns, they have felt that they needed it right away. I've hit my 10-minute mark, so I have to stop. But I will just say, I'll say one thing. The issue will be how you address regulatory things. And here, the fact that we are both democracies and that we have relatively high incomes will be a critical aspect, because our regulators try to reach the same level of protection, even if they go about it in a different way. And you will have our financial regulators, our pharmaceutical regulators, our toy regulators have increasingly found that they can use their counterpart transatlantic regulator as a partner to make them more efficient and more effective in addressing their domestic obligations. That will be the key. The Chamber and others have put forward a number of ideas. US and EU industry together have put forward ideas, and I think that once we begin to resolve those problems, they will take longer than it will take to conclude the negotiations. But there will be a lot of positive benefits from that evergreen aspect of the agreement. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed for those points, Peter, for being so concise. And again, if I had to pick out 2 points, your last point there about the fact that you believe, I think I heard you rightly, that regulators on both sides of the Atlantic, who we know have often ended up being either directly or indirectly the main obstacles, that they may be seeing in each other an opportunity to be able to broaden the scope of their own regulatory reach. And that right now, they rather than seeing each other as competitors, they may be partners in this process. That brings me to the second point. When you said that Mr. de Gucht was meeting the chamber, I kept thinking, he's going to Capitol Hill. He's going to see members of Congress in the chamber. But of course, you meant your chamber. And maybe we will want to come back later on with some of our other participants here who have experience of the United States as to the role of the House of Congress in overseeing those US regulatory agencies and whether we should be putting some emphasis there. In any case, let me turn now to Fulvio Conti, CEO of Enel. Mr. Conti, we look forward to your remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I owe you this thanks, but I also need to apologize because as soon as I finish speaking, I will have to leave in anticipation of an ongoing board which has been suspended while I'm here and need to be resumed. So I'm sorry, and again, apologies for that. After politicians, ministers, central bankers, former central bankers, and distinguished economists, what the hell an industrialist can offer to the audience? Testimony. I can witness on something that I feel is very important for any industrialist, any entrepreneur, any businessman, each side of the ocean, so to speak. The ocean should not be apart, but it should be just a pond, as they used to call it. Even though it was Winston Churchill, wasn't it, that said 2 people, referring to the UK and to the United States, 2 people divided by the common language at the end. We have been divided by a common ideology, maybe, which is the one that says free trade is better than no trade. Not only that, I think we have been testimony over the last decades, soon after the Second World War, that direct investments are also very, very important to both ends. And I'm here to testimony that. I'm here to offer the view that, indeed, United States and Europe have been, to some extent, busy retrenching on their own camp, doing things, Europeans, to try to get into a sort of union. We failed up until now. We need the United States' help to resume work and get reunited to the same fiscal policy as the United States have been able to do 200 years ago. And the United States needs Europe. If they really want to carry on their leadership role in the world and being able to face the competitions of the Chinese. We already given up on most of Africa to the Chinese. We are on the brink of giving it up to the Chinese in Latin America. And all of this is happening because we don't speak the right language. We're still divided by a common language between Europe and the United States. What do we need? Definitely we need, and I'm pleased to hear that there might be some movement in the near future when it comes to the trade agreement. We need more assertive roles of both Europe and the United States vis-a-vis their respective capacity to promote free trade all across the other parts of the world. As a commercial, I would say that we think in our little position as a company that I run, Enel, we're doing that. In as much as we're trying to be both appealing to financial investors from the United States into our capital stock, at the same time reinvesting some of our cash flows into the Americas. I would not limit the speech to the North America. I would not confine the agreement of what we need to do just to the United States. of America. I would say Americas, to me, looks like an overall potential opportunity. Today, Europe, vis-a-vis United States of America, has a sort of impairment in its ability to promote free trade because of tariff, because of exchange rates, because of whatever this, let me say, misbehavior of European individual countries maybe. United States are taking advantage of that to some extent, but at the same time trying to occupy territory which would be natural for Europeans to take, which is South America. And why we're doing all of this, again, the Chinese are moving forward. So what do we need to do? Definitely get to that agreement as soon as possible. Trying to see how we can cope with strong euros and weak dollars. It's quite astonishing to have been through the worst financial crisis of the potential collapse of the Eurozone, and euro being the strongest currency in the world. I mean, what am I missing from my economics studies that I should reconcile with you folks? What is missing is the political touch of a common European government and the awareness of the United States policymakers that they need to get back to Europe and abandon the idea that the Pacific Rim is going to be their destiny for the future. And both together, we should try to convert into a potential developer of the huge opportunities that are offered to us by South America. That's the way we have been moving as a company. We need to promote further our technological capacity to make progress in continents where, like Africa, for whatever is left available, and South America, for which likely it's mostly available, to have a common view about how to develop our free trade. And I would encourage the continuous debate on the way forward to that effect. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Conti. Thank you for those remarks and for giving us... Okay, we will keep your remarks in our mind, and let me just pull two of them out for our other panelists and participants to think about. I think you underscored there, Mr. Conti, one of the points that was made at the beginning, the importance of whatever this agreement is for potential strength for US and European companies in third markets. And I think it's very interesting to hear a business leader's perspective on this point, that access to those third markets is a central priority for business leaders right now, not simply how we deepen the opportunities across the Atlantic, but we also heard, yet again, the challenges of the currency, and that somehow this is this corrosive effect of the frustration with the imbalance, it appears at least, in the relative strengths and weaknesses of the dollar and the euro, which Lorenzo raised in his opening remarks as well. Christian, let me turn to you now in your capacity, I suppose, being very knowledgeable about, but also therefore having the difficult task of trying to coordinate multiple EU national perspectives as they prepare for this major initiative. What thoughts would you like to share with us?
Thanks, Robin. So you've had the politicians, the bankers, and the businessmen, and now you'll get the bureaucrat. I'm certainly no currency specialist, but I will say that as long as I've been a student or actor on transatlantic relations, which goes back to my student days in the early 1970s, we've been talking about currency tension between the US and the EU, basically ever since the US left the gold standard in 1971. So we've learned to live with it. We don't always live comfortably with it. It's an important element, and certainly one that needs to be taken into account as we move forward. One point with statistics that most of you probably know or have heard before, let's put this in perspective when we're talking about the EU-US transatlantic relationship. It's pretty big. It's still roughly half of world GDP. It's a good, comfortable third, if not 40% of world trade. So if we get that right, a lot of other things fall into place. It's 2 billion euro a day in trade in goods and services. It's 2,000 billion euro of mutual investment. So I don't think we need to worry to begin with about the foundations we're building on. We need to see how we can consolidate them to make this more effective for ourselves and to make it more effective as we turn to and work with the rest of the world. Would the benefits of an EU-US free trade deal be substantial or not? Would they be big or small? Given that we've already come quite far in liberalizing economic relations between us, they're not going to look big in relative terms, in percentages. But given the size of the relationship, that has a very big effect. Even small changes will have big effects. Lorenzi bin Ismail said we must go beyond just trade. Rest assured we are. In the work of the high-level group, which is nearing its end, we've been looking at all sides of the relationship. And the group came quite early in its interim report last summer to the interim conclusion that the best way forward is indeed a free trade agreement, but a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. That means, first, tariff reductions or tariff elimination. Will it be 100%? Will it be 95 or 90%? We don't know. The objective is 100%. Second, services liberalization. Opening up services market that are currently closed, putting in place, maybe more important, a framework for better cooperation between regulators in terms of further liberalization of other sectors of services, including whatever obstacles exist at sub-federal level in the US or at sub-national level in the UN, in Europe. Third, public procurement. Hugely important, not least to European business. Roughly 25% of European GDP come from companies that do a large part of their business through public procurement. They bring together 30 million jobs. So opening up on both sides of the Atlantic, the public procurement markets will have a very important effect. And fourthly, as has been mentioned by several speakers already, regulatory cooperation. That's often the hardest bit, finding ways of overcoming regulatory differences, even when, as Peter Chase said, we're pursuing the same objective. I've sometimes likened the EU and the US in that area to the two bullies in the schoolyard. We're sort of eyeing each other up. We know we're both pretty big, and we're used to people doing what we tell them to do. When a Canadian hears someone from Washington say the US and Canada are equal partners, they know what it means. Same goes for Norway with the EU. And suddenly here we are, two large equal partners who have to size each other up and find a way forward. And indeed, therefore, the challenge here is to find a cooperative rather than conflictive approach to regulatory cooperation. Probably best, as has been done a little bit already in the EU-US energy dialogue, taking a forward-looking approach saying, let's not start with arguing over the regulatory frameworks we have. Let's start with discussing what we want the future regulatory frameworks to look like, including in areas where there is very little regulation so far. Finally, we also want to look in this agreement at issues like competition rules, labor standards, environment standards, intellectual property rules. It will therefore be a pretty comprehensive approach to the economic exchanges across the North Atlantic. That's not going to be easy. And given how much work has already gone into that relationship, there isn't really any low-hanging fruit that can be readily picked. There are no quick fixes. They're not going to be snappy early results, except hopefully by concluding the negotiation. It's going to be difficult on both sides to get the full buy-in by political constituencies at capital or European level and at the other levels that will be involved. But we do believe that despite those difficulties, we have pretty good prospects. It may seem somewhat, I don't know, defeatist that our best prospects are at the moment when we've both just gone through or are going through the worst economic crisis in half a century or more. But in a sense, that's a sign of the health of the relationship. We're not turning inward, we're not turning away from each other. We're seeing that the best way forward and the best way out of this crisis is working together. We're very close already at concluding a similar agreement with Canada. Commissioner de Gucht will continue from Washington to Ottawa at the end of this week to seek to conclude the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with Canada. Contains most of the elements, has given the EU a good dry run for what negotiations can look like with the US. The timetable that Peter Chase outlined, opening negotiations this summer, concluding before the end of 2014, may seem wildly optimistic compared to other trade negotiations. But so much preparatory work has gone into this that we do believe that that is, in fact, a realistic time frame, given also the political priority that has been afforded to this. Let me maybe say last, come back to a point made earlier. This is not just about economics. It's about a lot more than that. It's about deepening and strengthening and consolidating the transatlantic community overall. It's about sending a strong signal about our continued shared commitment to open markets and also to open societies. It's about setting standards between ourselves in a manner which, let's be clear, will probably set the standards for the world in the years ahead. And it is about consolidating a long-term, sustained transatlantic partnership for joint engagement and cooperation, not just across the North Atlantic, but around the globe. And that, I think, came out very clearly in the reference that US Vice President Biden made to this at the Munich Security Conference. Not a coincidence that he took up the transatlantic trade deal in the foremost security policy forum in Europe. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Christian. Very helpful comments. And again, you laid out a number of points we'll come back to. I'm struck by the fact that there would be a certain irony if one is able to open up aspects of the service market across the Atlantic before we're fully able to do it within the EU. And maybe, again, there will be a knock-on effect of these transatlantic agreements that will play into some of the internal EU negotiations or discussions as well. But you've made a number of good points, but I don't want to rehearse them now. Let me turn to Riccardo Monti. Riccardo, we have another private sector perspective from you to conclude with, but I think business is what this agreement is all about. And again, very interesting to hear your perspectives of how this may be helpful from an Italian perspective.
Well, as a president of the Trade Commission, I think I'm a bureaucrat, although a new one, because I'm very new into the bureaucracy. Most of what I wanted to say has been said already. I'd like to give a few comments on how relevant and how critical it is to go forward very fast with this agreement. I mean, free trade, we know that trade is not a zero-sum game, but let me highlight how immense are the potential benefit of free trade. I think we should pick up on what is a big success story, the NAFTA. NAFTA has been an amazing success story. Mexican export to the US have quadrupled, but also Mexican export towards the rest of the world and multiplied by 8. And just to give you the Italian perspective, our export to Mexico has been benefiting big time from this explosion of the industrial base in Mexico. This year we have 4 billion euro of trade surplus with Mexico. It's basically machinery and all the equipment that feeds in this massive manufacturing boom in Mexico. So this is to say that this trade agreement not only benefit the immediate flows, but they generate an overall positive effect. and Peter Che was mentioning, I think, I'm not sure about the estimate, but definitely thinking about the potential of increasing 1.5% European GDP in a moment in which we lack growth very badly. It's an astonishing prospect. But let me go back to another part of the world. Pacific trade has been booming too. And if you think of Pacific, the Pacific area is much less homogeneous and is much more full of tensions. If you think about what's happening, the border, China has a bordering dispute with many of its neighbors, and there is of course some challenge between US and China for supremacy, and still trade is booming. So my idea is, here we are two traditional old friends, shared value, shared language, and very often, so we should really do much more. So the trade between US and Europe is a success story, but still there's a lot of untapped potential, and I do hope this agreement can go forward very, very fast. I don't want to jump into next session, but I would like to emphasize the concept that trade between US and Latin America is a success story, US and Europe a success story, Europe and Latin America a success story. What is really missing in the picture is Africa. And still trade with Africa of each of these three geographies is a fraction, a tiny fraction of the total of trade, and is a tiny fraction of the potential. The only area that has created a substantial trade with Africa is China, and as Fulvio Conti was saying, this is also part of a much more wide, let me say, penetration plan, which is to some extent a bit too much, because Italy and Europe and the US should play a much bigger role in Africa than it plays now. So going back to the free trade agreement between US and Europe, I do believe that if we do it fast, then it's going to be much easier to attract for gravity the Latin America leg and the African leg. So I think timing is key, as Peter Chase was mentioning, and I think we should really focus on the nitty-gritty, devil's in the details. I think we should not underestimate the technical complexity of some of the non-tariff barriers. If you look at, for example, the food sector, we have done a simulation, and without touching the existing regulation, we could unblock something between 4 and 6 billion euro of Italian food export just by working on the details of how the controllers are made, on all the technicalities of healthcare control. So let's not forget that this is a, let me say, clerical, complex, long work on each item, on each category. We have to find a way to unlock and unblock sometimes minimal hurdles that, if you sum it up, it becomes billions and billions of trade that does not happen. So just to summarize, I know we're running out of time. Last comment, I was in Davos with our President Mario Monti, and we had a lot of discussions with some of the business leaders. Yes, we are very worried about the euro, having the only boys in the bloc who does not play with the rate of its currency. Our exporters and most of German exporters are very worried every time the euro goes over 136, 137. It's billions and billions of export loss and thousands and thousands of job loss. So I do believe this should be at the center of the debate, because yes, we can live with some instability in the trade with US and the euro, but we cannot live with the concept that euro keeps gaining relative power vis-a-vis the renminbi, vis-a-vis the one in Japan, and we just accept that we lose competitiveness. I think this is not acceptable. This is a very serious issue. Last but not least, the service component. Of course, we shouldn't put service at the center of this discussion because we didn't fix it in Europe yet, but I want to emphasize how critical it is to learn how to export service and how to liberalize service. Developed economy are made 72, 73, 75% out of service, but trade is, by far dominated by manufacturing. I think it's absolutely vital that we manage somehow to put service at the center of the discussion with the US, even though we did a poor job in Europe and within Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Riccardo. Thank you for being disciplined with your time. So we do have, I don't know, depending on what Marta Su lets us do, maybe 15 minutes to run to the end. Here we just take 5 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes over. I want to give a chance to each of our opening panelists to be able to maybe wrap up and make a final comment. They may want to comment on what they heard from each other. But let me give an opportunity for others. We've got a great group around the table today of participants. If anyone would like to make some comments, they don't have to be questions. They could be sharing thoughts. If you could, as the gentleman there is putting in my glasses, can nearly get me there. Hennessy, exactly. If you could put your little nameplates up, then I'll know. I'll call on you, hopefully in the order in which I see them go up. And if you could try and keep it to 1 or 2 minutes, and that'll give an opportunity for me to go around the table. But let me start with you. I'm going to come here. Then.
Thank you. I'm Patrick Hennessy, the Irish ambassador. I just really wanted to come in on something that's a topic that's a major priority for the Irish presidency of the European Union at present. Our goal, our theme for the presidency is stability, jobs and growth. And this is obviously something that preoccupies all of us in the Union at present. To pick up that excellent phrase about deficit-free stimulus that appears in the report and has been mentioned earlier, there are really quite a limited number of ways in which one can promote growth while avoiding adding to the deficit. One is working on the single market, something that the Italian administration has been very active on and has done excellent work on. The other, and in parallel with that, is obviously moving ahead on trade agreements. And within that, the prospects for moving forward with the US-Europe trade agreement is one that is extremely important, and as I said, one to which the presidency attaches a huge priority. We've obviously been eagerly awaiting the adoption of the high-level group report, and we obviously hope that we are indeed very close to the document being endorsed. In terms of process, I think from the intention and the planning is very much around very early endorsement by the European Council of the report, and giving a mandate to Council to prepare a mandate for the discussions, for the negotiations. If it were indeed to be the case that this high-level group report came out this week, the European Council later this week will of course be discussing trade. That would be excellent. But in any event, we hope that this will happen within a very short number of days, so that either this month or next month the European Council can indeed give the mandate to Council. It's the intention to use the April meeting of the informal meeting of EU trade ministers, which will take place in Dublin during the month of April, that will be devoted to advancing the work on the mandate still further, with the intention that the June meeting of the Council, the Trade Council, would complete would agree the mandate for the negotiations to get underway. So certainly from the point of view of the presidency, this is an extremely high priority. We're very keen to move forward absolutely as fast as possible, and we'll do everything we can to achieve that objective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me go to Pasquale Terracciano, please.
Thank you. Just 3 quick comments in my capacity of GH Sherpa. Certainly, trade is probably priority number 1 in our discussions. And it is not obviously the panacea of all evils, but there is no other show in town at the moment if we want to foster growth. And without growth, there is nothing at this stage. The second consideration is the kind of agreement we should aim at. Free trade is, of course, the major goal, but a fair trade, a fair agreement is also of the essence. If we don't solve now that we are starting negotiations, all problems involved in liberalizing services, eliminating non-tariff barriers, protecting geographic denominations, and so on, we probably will be left with a incomplete and not viable in the end agreement that could be blocked right at the final stage. the third consideration is that apart from of course, the political will which is needed, and it's needed, for example, to overcome the reservations on protected sectors such as the agricultural one, then at the technical level, what worries me is the regulatory framework. This can be a major stumbling block in a negotiation. And I wonder if having as a final aim getting to a common regulation framework, it wouldn't be possible to think of a mutual recognition of standards in an interim phase, so that we can kick off with a TAFTA pretty soon, just recognizing Europe and US, the standards of the other, waiting for a common solution for the future.
I think it'd be fair to say, if I may say, Mr. Chaniel, that the issue of mutual recognition, I think, is the way forward, and even that may be too difficult. So I don't know, I'll let others come to this point in a minute, but from my understanding, my sense is that common regulations not expected, mutual recognition the goal, but even that may be difficult. We may end up having to have sort of recognizing certified compliance of each other's regulations. So it could even be one step further back. So maybe we can, I'll let others come back to this point. Maybe Peter, I'm sure you've looked in some detail at this topic as well. Maybe you could address this point of where do we hit the regulatory framework? Because I think Mr. Terracciano's really hit a very important point. Fran Burwell.
Thank you. I think this all looks very positive when you look at it from the perspective of people sitting around this room and from the perspective of those seeing the overarching value of the agreement. The problem is that if it's your industry that has been protected, your services, whatever, your product, it becomes much more difficult. And I fear that we are going to, after a launch of this, get into a situation where there may be certain individuals, particularly up on Capitol Hill, but I'm cognizant also that the European Parliament must approve this agreement. We have seen some agriculture senators call for hearings, which is their right, and it may not be anything negative, but we need to find a way to continue moving forward and to create political will, not just to get this launched, but to keep it moving forward. And so I'm interested in kind of the balance between the trade negotiators' natural inclination to have a single undertaking where nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, versus the need to have moments of victory so that you keep driving this forward. Right now in Washington, we seem to have a lot of political will behind it, including by people who normally don't focus on trade. This is the project for the transatlantic partnership over the next moment of time. But we need to not get too bogged down. We need to be creative in perhaps leapfrogging over some moments of disagreement, putting some things on the back burner, being a little bit imaginative about this. I think the negotiators are also going to have to be transparent. I've been in some meetings where the preliminary soundings out that have been going on have been criticized for not being transparent enough to the business community. And so I think that if we can keep a little bit more openness about the accomplishments that are being reached, even if it's not finalized, it may help us move this forward and accomplish our aim of getting it done in 2 years and not having it drag out as we get closer to the next set of elections and it then becomes an electoral football. Thank you.
Thank you for injecting that note of cautious pessimism, but in a constructive sense, I think, knowing you, Fran. And let me turn to Stefano Stefanini, the advisor to the President. Stefano.
Thank you. I have a more general question. I think we've been discussing actually two separate scenarios. So if our goal, our eventual goal, is a wider and deeper Atlantic encompassing both North and South Atlantic, But the main game in town now at the moment is the Europe-United States FTA. So again, there's the North Atlantic scenario. How do we envisage the roadmap? A series of building blocks built separately. So we first deal with Europe, the US, then maybe Africa. But one after the other, or we start thinking already now about a comprehensive framework that I realize also from a number of points of view, also politically, it's more difficult to put together. Thank you.
Again, I think an excellent point for me to take back now so we can finish on time to each of our panelists, just to make a last 2-minute comment maybe of any of the key points you picked up there. But I think this issue of the political dimension, I hope somebody will take on how we engage legislators. Does it make sense to be doing a single undertaking? The point Stefano made there at the end about whether we build in right now the capacity for expansion to third countries or other regional blocs. And obviously the very important question about what kind of regulatory framework are we thinking about here? So any comments that people like to make? Why don't I go in reverse order so that we can finish up perhaps with the most macroeconomic view, Lorenzo, from you. But Riccardo, do you mind if I start with you, as you were very disciplined with your time, and give you a chance to come in first and give your comment, and then I'll run through Christian and backwards that way.
Yeah, just a quick one on the regulation and the need to use regulation as a Trojan horse to decrease barriers. I repeat myself, but I think that if we manage to put the service component at the center of the transatlantic discussion, we'll be able to force against the resistance and overcome the resistance we have within Europe. If we have the US, who has a very strong and also export-driven service economy, if they say, listen, we're serious about the free trade agreement with Europe, but we have to put the service at the center, we will be able to overcome resistance within Europe, and we will do a great service to our future generation. That's my comment.
Thank you. That was a very good point. Let me move now to Christian Leffler.
Okay, just a couple of things. On standards and standard setting, yes, indeed, compatible standards rather than common standards is the most likely way forward. Certainly when it comes to increasing recognition of existing standards when the objective pursued is the same. Also for the future, because our overall frameworks in which standards are set are somewhat different. So as long as we can then be clear on what it is we want to achieve, then compatibility is the most likely order of the day. In terms of political constituencies, our sense is that there's probably been more footwork done at this stage by various European actors in the European Parliament than there have been by US actors in Congress. There are all sorts of reasons for that. One, a rather important election that took place last autumn. But there's clearly an awful lot more to do there, and that has to do not least with the issue of someone here called free trade versus fair trade. I always get a bit nervous when I hear fair trade because that's very much in the eyes of the beholder, and whoever happens to get a little bit squeezed might think that that is unfair. And that's one of the big issues that we're going to deal with, and to try to convey the message to the legislators that it is their common responsibilities to look at the overall picture and therefore what's in the benefit to their respective societies rather than very narrow constituencies. That's never easy, and it doesn't get easier the closer we get to elections, which is one of the reasons we're in a hurry.
Christian, do you think there's any don't have to answer this, a long question, but is any legwork being done in European national parliaments? It may be being done in the European Parliament, but is it being done at that political level as well in Europe?
Our impression is that in many national parliaments, yes, though not yet all.
we won't ask which ones it hasn't been done in, because that could set up some minefields, but that's an important answer. I'm going to go Peter Chase, Lorenzo, and I'm going to give, of course, the last word to Fabrizio Sacomani, who will pull this all together. I know that's a dangerous thing to say to you, sir, but still. So, Peter.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to stay focused on the mechanics because the mechanics are important. And again, I say so underscoring that I see this as far more, as much a geostrategic and broadly important political agreement as I do an economic agreement. The reason I said that this can be done, and this will get to many of the comments that were raised, the reason I said it could be done, the negotiations could be concluded before the end of next year, is because the only way we will conclude the negotiations at all is if we come into the negotiations with a very clear eye as to how we will do them. It will have to be done in a way where the market opening aspects of trade in goods, trade in services, government procurement, investment, mobility of workers and professionals, IPR, these issues will be addressed by our trade negotiators. And as between the United States and the EU, we actually are not far apart. We can do this and do this quickly. That's all market opening in a straightforward sense. And if you can do that, then you need to deal with, and this is, I think, talking a little bit about what Fran was getting at, then you say, how are we going to do the regulatory issues? In this agreement that you conclude, on a regulatory part, you say very clearly, what is your goal? What's the goal of the regulators? You give the regulators tools, as in legislative authority and various other things, and then you create a mechanism to facilitate how the regulators, counterpart regulators, work together. If people walk into this with a clear eye to the economic benefits, if they walk into it with a clear eye to the broader geopolitical aspects, if they walk into it knowing, in fact, that it can be a building block for a greater free trade, greater integration between the northern and southern parts of the Western Hemisphere, then we can get this agreement done, I believe, by the Italian presidency, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the second half of next year. So we start with the Irish presidency, we end with the Italian presidency. That would be a beautiful thing. But it also, and I want to stress this, it also places a responsibility on us and on many of the people here in Rome to make sure that they manage expectations, that they address agricultural issues, which will have to be addressed in the United States and here. And I think Mr. Monti's comments about the potential gains in the agro-food industries of Italy in exports to the United States was very important. Fran was right. There will be people who will say, I'm going to be hurt, and those voices will be loud. We need to keep in mind the broader gains, which will be very real as we bring this to conclusion.
Thank you. Lorenzo.
Well, very briefly, I mean, on growth, it's true that trade is maybe one of the only channels left to foster growth, so we should try to exploit all possible margins which can come from trade liberalization. My remark on exchange rates was not a way to discourage these negotiations, but simply keeping them in mind. And I have only one comment on the issue of standard. I think we should look at this issue going forward. This may be the last chance for Europe and the US to have a say in standard setting. This is the last one. The next round, somebody else will have another say at least, and it's not clear whether Europe and the US will have the same strength as they have today. So given the attitude that other in particular China, has had so far, I think we should take this opportunity and make sure that this will be then used by others in the most liberalized way, in a sense that promotes also the values that the US and Europe have promoted. Thank you.
Thank you. And let me finish now with Fabrizio Saccomanni.
No, I don't intend to sum up, but I just wanted to make a point similar to what I think Lorenzo just said. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that the central bankers are against trade liberalization. By all means, you know, and I'm impressed by the sort of the time frame that both European and American negotiators have basically accepted. I think if they stick to that, it will be very good. But at the same time, perhaps, you know, drawing from a point made by Mr. Monti, you know, I mean, I wonder how strong the liberalization efforts on the European side would be if the euro-dollar rate goes to 140, for example, you know, and that could happen very quickly if the European crisis is resolved in some way or another, and then if political tensions in some key European countries are resolved. So I think that should be kept in mind. But one way of doing that is perhaps that would be at some point to bring on the negotiating table both the trade and the finance ministers of the major partners involved, because, you know, they respond to different constituencies. You know, the finance minister, you know, normally says, you know, exchange rates, leave it to the market, you know, and that is not the same type of approach that the trade minister normally takes. Said, yeah, okay, leave it to the market, but fair competition, avoid retaliation, and so forth. So I think you need to bring these two people together so that, you know, the approach that each take to this is mutually reinforcing. Thank you.
Practical suggestion, and a very important one to finish on. We've gone a little bit over time, but I think just the quality of the contributions that have been made around the table have captured the fact, Marta, that this was a great topic to put on the agenda for you, GMF, EI, and so on. As Peter and others indicated, I think something is going to happen, and it's going to happen very soon. My personal view is, if it happens, for all the reasons we've heard here around the table, failure, I would say, is not an option. You cannot lay out all of these absolutely essential benefits to the near-term stimulative growth effect, the geopolitical and geoeconomic dimensions that have been given, as Lorenzo said, a last chance for the US and the EU to really be defining standards that are transparent and open in a world that is growing. Set all that up and then fail. It's not that you will not go back to status quo ante. You will go back, or we will go back, to something worse. So I think we just all need to realize what we're stepping into here. It's a very exciting moment, in my opinion. I think the benefits and the opportunities even outweigh the risks in both senses. But this is a very historic moment, and I think it's great that we do have, from here, the Irish ambassador, and through to Italy, a lot of responsibility lying on certain governments around this table. But I think a great contribution, and please give a hand to all of our panelists and contributors.
Thank you very much indeed to all the speakers, and to Robin for a wonderful sharing. Thank you, Fabrizio. I know that you have to leave. I'm a bit sorry for this coming forth, but it's unavoidable being in Rome, you know. I would like to say to my friend, the Director General for Europe, Luigi Mattiolo, that we have really a good program for our presidency of the European Union. So let's stay focused on this program together with our Irish friends. And then we switch to the second part of our discussion, which is, in a sense, a less material and much more geometrical and schemist one. But I will leave the chair to Stefano Silvestri, because IAI was the main organization behind this project, And so, Stefano, please, you have the chair.
Okay, thank you, Marta. Well, I think that I have not much to say. We have the questions which have been put by the paper givers on the program, the mapping of the Pan-Atlantic space. We'll see if what the paper has traced in has tried to describe both as a reality today and possibly a possibility. If that rings somewhere and it has a future, but I will do, we have about 1 hour, a little less, so I think that I have not to make speech now, and I will give immediately the floor for the introductory remarks to Mario Pezzini from the OECD in Paris. Where is Pezzini? Oh, that's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the floor. Thank you very much for inviting me in this very interesting meeting. I have a burden now, as you said, to introduce the second part, which is, under my point of view, much more structural in nature. I will do it by assuming one point to be demonstrated therefore, but assuming just that, and then treating in particular 2 aspects that I think are crucial for these subjects. The first has to deal with the fact that we have diverging economic situation with a series of partners that are around the table and have been put around the table as it was recalled before in Skirat under the initiative of Mr. Lalimi, Minister of Plan of Morocco. And now again, we are discussing here today. But at the same time, this will be my second point, there are some common challenges that, despite different origin, can be addressed together. And my conclusion will be that we will have a base for discussion on which further development can be undertaken. Let me therefore start with the assumption. The assumption is the change that we have observed in the last two decades are not short-term change, but actually structural changes. And as such, they indicate a situation that is going to remain a situation of different economic performances around the Atlantic, north and south, despite all the traditional references to a common natural value identity, particularly when it comes to Europe and Latin America. This situation that in the OECD Development Center we have called shifting wealth is a situation in which, if we observe the 10 years of the 90s and we double the average rate of growth of OECD country, we observe that 13 countries were capable to be better than the double than the OECD. They included, not surprisingly, China, as well as Chile, as well as few other small countries. But if we observe the first 10 years of 2000, this millennium, well, the countries that were capable to have more than the double rate of growth of OECD countries were not 13, they were 83, which in itself designate a major change in the world. Now, obviously, we are among economists. Many may say the rate of growth of OECD declined a little bit in the second decades. Right, we apply the same rate of the 90s, still 50 countries were capable to have more than the double of the rate of growth. So my assumption is that this shift in wealth is structural. What are we observing in the short term? Well, Africa real GDP growth over 2003-2011 has been around 5.2% per year, which means rates that are obviously not at easy reach for the northern part of the Atlantic, despite the different answers that have been given to the economic crisis, as Mr. Binismaki summarized so well. In 2011, after the Arab Spring, the rate of Africa was 3.4, 2012, 4.5, 2013 is expected to be 4.8. If we separate sub-Saharan Africa,
we are around 5.1, 5.4 over these 3 years. If we look at Latin America, where things are growing, but less than in Africa, the rate is 3.2 in 2012, 4 expected in 2013. In a certain sense, the paths are different. For sure, different are the macroeconomic policies that these different areas are undertaking. There are a lot of differences within the big Atlantic. It was suggested by the question. Central America, depending on subcontracting work, is in a different trajectory of development than part of the Andean countries that, as we know, depend much more on natural resources and in particular minerals. The same apply to Africa. But in general, we may observe this divergent tradition, which implies that the common discourse that says now we are all interrelated, and therefore by strengthening further our interrelationship, we will get common benefit, is not for sure at the rendezvous. It's not sure that this is the argument that can be used when we have countries and geographic areas that are in part on diversifying trajectories. My second point is that, however, despite different trajectories, there are, for reasons that varies a lot from one side to the other of the Atlantic, some common challenges. And the common challenges come in many cases, if we observe the developing country, assume that we, around the table, we know pretty well what are the challenges of the northern part of the Atlantic. In that case, they can be very often summarized with the name of the middle income trap. In many of these countries, we observed that productivity was incapable to grow despite all this rate of growth. These countries were not capable to follow the example of Korea, for example, that starting with the same GDP 30 years ago is now a member of the OECD and is now a country that has been capable to catch up, both in terms of rate of growth and in terms of productivity. The issue of productivity is a serious one, in particular because within this country we observe at least two different types. One is the country whose development is based on raw material that are observing an increasing rate of exchange, as a consequence, a decreasing competitiveness for the manufacturing activities, a further lock-in of their economy, specializing even more in minerals, and therefore the incapacity to get out of all the consequences that may come from a reduction demand of those raw material or the discovery of new sources. Therefore, for these countries, the question is how to use the rent in order to operate something that was always in the radar but was never implemented. There was a further diversification of their economy, and in particular, the strengthening of an extremely weak manufacturing. And when I'm saying manufacturing, I'm not talking about the existence of multinationals that now start to be present everywhere, and they come from Morocco, come from Brazil, come from different developing countries. I'm talking about the fabric of small and medium-sized firms, where is concentrated, in reality, the very low level of productivity. If the large firms in OECD country have 6 times the productivity of the small firms, in the case of, have 1.6 times, in OECD, the productivity of the small firms. In these countries, in Latin America and Africa, the productivity of large firms is 6 times the productivity of small firms. Now, what could be done in this case? The country themselves are calling the action that are required industrial policy. We have a lot of resistances to enter in this type of discussion as OECD country. We have observed some failure in the past when it came to developing, for example, large public investment. Then in this country have produced what was usually called cathedral in the desert. And therefore there are there is some skepticism. Nevertheless, how to strengthen the comparative advantages and to exploit opportunity for development that remain largely untapped is the issue at stake. I think that for this case is not the only one. There are countries such as Costa Rica that are countries where the capacity to growth is not related to natural resources, is related to be subcontractor of global value chain. In both cases, the problem is industrial policy, and somehow this is a problem present more and more in Europe. Let's just refer to the recent declaration about the need for development bank in France and in England. They are just latest example of a rethinking about these stories. But there is a second point about threats that are common for completely different reasons, and they rely on social cohesion. There has been a country that for 10 years, the first 10 years of this millennium, had 5% of growth every year, a level of deficit of the public expenditure of the public budget of 3%, a debt of 42%, and total enrollment in school. This country is called Tunisia, and these data were before the Arab Spring. In other terms, the incapacity of the government to translate growth into involvement of people and creating opportunity for jobs, particularly for the young generation, is creating a crisis. How to answer this problem? It resembles very closely to the problem that we address for unemployment in OECD countries. They are not necessarily created by the same causes, but both we are brought to rethink about the intervention of the state in these areas. I conclude by saying, therefore, that the answer is not easy. What could be a platform to discuss? There is a need, common needs, and the need concerns not only food, not only natural, ensuring security for food, but it concerns also capacity to improve productivity, and it concerns also capacity to deal with social cohesion. Under the Atlantic, we could constitute a table, but it will start by discussing issues before getting to the point in which treaty could be seriously addressed. So it's a long way, but that's exactly what the Marshall Fund, for example, has ensured for the Northern Atlantic for long. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I think I'll give immediately the floor for very short periods, I must say, because we have a very, very limited period of time, to Hassan Abouyub, the ambassador of the Kingdom of Morocco in Italy, also because for himself and because also Morocco, as we have seen before the introduction of his minister, has been one of the countries which has more invested in the Atlantic space as such. Please, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, dear friend and professor. Yes, we invested a lot in Atlantic and in free trade. It happened that one important round of the so-called GATT at the time, WTO now, was concluded in Marrakesh. I remember very well having been one of the major players at the time, because Marrakesh was due to my involvement in the textile and agriculture negotiations at that time, that the main obsession of the big players, I mean the trade market, US to name it, Canada and others, is how to use the Uruguay round to put enough pressure on China to have China on board. These countries considered having China on board more important than opening the markets in the old membership of the GATT. And because of that, I think we made a lot of mistakes, because the consensus at that time was to consider China as an opportunity. And nobody took it as a major, between brackets, competition threat. Then happened what happened, and the image changed completely. And now, since I started this project with my friend Lahlimi, on the Atlantic in 2004. I was still in Paris. And we had the first meetings, thanks to the OECD Development Center, the Braga di Macedo, to name him. And we started in the Eastern Europe, particularly using the wonderful hospitality of Praga, the city of the Czech Republic now. And we started building a group of like-minded people to push. It's quite amazing to go to Czech Republic to speak about the perspective of the Atlantic space. But nevertheless, I personally observed a huge shift in the behavior of what I can call the negotiator, or at least the debater of the issue. And this behavior is shifting from arrogance to more of realism and pragmatism, particularly in Europe. And I think time is ripe now to revisit the paradigms on which we elaborated our main strategies regarding the challenges, the crisis we are facing. For instance, the asymmetrical approach to solving the debt crisis or euro and dollar crisis, in my opinion, is leading to the same common result. It increases the indebtedness, and it's not a solution. What is the American model is not a sustainable solution. What is the European model is even worse. And based on that, I think we have to go to the essentials. How to deal with social cohesion in the framework of long-term budget adjustments without having the institutions to handle these policies. This is my big issue, and I'll be running toward the conclusion in saying that I think now more than before, we feel the independence or the interdependence between regions. If I take the example of my country, unfortunately, I'm pegged to Europe. To euro and to Europe. 85% of my currency rate is defined by the euro. I'm sorry. We made a choice. We know what it means in terms of competitiveness. And we're aware of that we have to pay the price, but it's not bad on the long run, of course, having in mind the German approach to the monetary policy. And beyond that, yes, beyond that, we discovered that 89% in 2012 of our financial flows are with Europe. So whatever is happening in Europe is touching us directly, particularly in acceding to the very narrow market of the sovereign debt. Your policies in the north, in Washington and Brussels, are directly impeding my flexibility margin to be bigger than what I have now in financing my current account because of the choices, because of the free trade option I've taken 25 years ago. I have an economy driven by domestic demand. I have limits. I'm aware of that. So how can I cope with that? Obviously within a framework of a wider space where common responsibility is exercised, where common endeavor is exercised. And I think what we'll be discovering from this initiative is that it is a space where there is no China, no Middle East conflict, no Palestinian-Israel constraints. We can work quite at ease to go beyond the restrictions we know very well, what I call sovereign restrictions on trade. Because, and I'll put it at the end like this, free trade is okay, but real free trade, which is with agriculture and services. I'm sorry to say that, and recall that. And if you put that in the equation, those remarks will not work. I invested 25 years of my life in trade, and I can tell you all the models, econometrical models we worked out are very clear. When you put agriculture and services and the free trade agreements, it works very well. It increases the growth and the global productivity factor. In regions like Europe, where demography is dead, no big increase in the productivity, I'm sorry to say, you have no assets to finance your indebtedness. And it can be solved within the framework of a global approach to this space and macro policies where South America, North America, Africa, and Europe will, each of these big players, take part of the burden, because what's at stake is the redefinition of the welfare design we inherited from Second World War. And I think it's possible to redefine and redesign this welfare pattern in this big space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think it has been very heartening. Now I give the floor to Ambassador Luis Alfonso de Alba, who is representing Mexico at the United Nations. Please, Ambassador.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor, and thank you very much for the invitation, particularly to Marta. I find myself in a strange situation on which I don't know whether to start talking about Mexico or the global scenario. So let me choose for the global scenario, because I think if we are serious about building a strong linkage across the Atlantic, I think we need to start by recognizing that there is an international global crisis, and particularly when it comes to institutions. We have difficulties, obviously, in WTO, but those difficulties goes far beyond all the Bretton Woods institution. I would say in the process of looking for drastic reforms to be capable of playing a role, not to become totally irrelevant. And that's very much also the spirit in the United Nations today. We are embarking in a number of processes to identify ways of getting this relevance and being able to play a significant role to basically to support growth, development, but also to do it in a different form, because the crisis is not just the financial or the food crisis that has been quite severe, but it is also the lack of understanding of new trends and new players in the ground. And that's, I think it's going to be particularly useful to take into account when we look into the cross-Atlantic relationship. It is, on the one hand, obviously the emergence of some economies, strong economies, Mexico among them, but it is also a different conception of development. It's a fundamental change in the way we conceive development. The environmental dimension is getting into the picture, finally. Negotiations on climate change and other bigger processes need to be taken into account, because they imply transformations so deep that no one can achieve on their own. Those are issues that need to be dealt globally. And if we do not take into account these changes, we will be facing a lot of difficulties. The traditional relationship, the North-South relationship, is gone. There are a number of factors in international cooperation today which do not belong to the North in terms of donors and active countries. But there is also a need to transform the way we do international cooperation. So you have two elements basically on the scenario which need to be dealt. What we are trying is to put a number of pieces together in a new, within a new approach, and we are focusing our attention in 2015. There are a number of processes, as I mentioned, which need to converge by then, and we need to have a definition of a new development agenda by 2015. It's going to be kind of the continuation of the Millennium Development Goals, but obviously those new goals need to be, first of all, universal. It's no longer the case of focusing on least developed countries and trying to shift some resources there, but it is basically to have an agenda that will have goals and objectives for all countries, including developed countries, when it comes to the reduction of emissions and other issues. It has to be also an agenda, as I mentioned, that integrates correctly the environmental dimension together with the social dimension and the economic dimension. Not only the economic one. We need, and it has been raised within this meeting, the need of a different balance and particular attention to the social cohesion. Coming from that scenario to Mexico, I think that Mexico has been playing a key role in bridging differences between North and South, probably more than any other country, because of our own situation and because of our own decision. If you look into any global negotiation process going on today, you will find that Mexico is always pushing for the bridging, for I would hesitate to use the word consensual approach because I personally hate the word consensus. I think this is probably the main obstacle for international organizations and for global issues. We have not been able to advance because the word consensus has been distorted to the extent that today it implies a veto power for some members. And that was my hesitation to use that word. But at least we have been a bridge builder. We have been trying to identify areas on which the international community can move. Cancun Conference on Climate Change is, I think, a good example of what we have been able to do as a contribution. But also in terms of trade, we are putting a candidate to the WTO, Herminio Blanco, which represents to a large extent the spirit with which Mexico has campaigned and supported free trade in all its dimensions. We are one of the countries who have probably the greatest number of free trade agreements, including with the European Union, including with the United States, etc. So this situation of Mexico as a bridge builder, as a country which is putting its own priorities, its own needs, very much linked to the global priorities, to a conception of international relations on which no country would be able to deal with its own problems without cooperation, is something that may be interesting. We have a number of areas on which we will need to focus, and I would like to highlight that also, as it has been done on some occasions during this session, that it's not only economics, it's a number of areas, geopolitical areas that need to be touched, including mobility, security, and others. I will not extend myself on that, but let me finalize with a few comments on the way it could work also in the benefit of Africa. I think there are a number of examples on which we have been able, through the South-South cooperation and also through triangular cooperation, to expand some of the experiences of Latin America, the good experience into some African countries, and that may be also an additional input that we could bring into the picture to build this alliance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We are in a country who loves building bridges, so. Well, Hinles, please, from the German Marshall Fund.
Stefano, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here to talk about this topic, which, if it's not exactly in the mainstream of what the German Marshall Fund has done for the last 40 years, I think it should be, and is very much in the spirit of what we've been about. Let me just make a couple of very brief remarks from an American perspective, sort of around the question of why the United States should be interested in such a widening of the Atlantic debate in space. I think there are a couple of things to be said here. I mean, the first is, and some of this has already come out from our discussion, that there are clearly a series of very kind of practical drivers of American interest in the Atlantic looking south, including our own hemisphere. One that I think is very much worth mentioning in light of our recent elections is simply the changing demographics in the United States and a changing sense of what matters to the American public and American elites, business elites, political elites. Many Americans increasingly are looking south. They may be from the south. There's an issue of mobility here, but they're looking south in terms of their interests. There is a big people-to-people dimension here which is worth emphasizing. It's surely about Mexico, but it reaches much further south than that. I think, some here may be able to correct me if I'm wrong, there are something like 10 flights a day from Brazil to Miami alone. I mean, this gives you a sense of the kind of physical connection that now exists, and I can only imagine this getting stronger. What it means in a way is that the United States doesn't just have one international policy, it actually has multiple regional international policies. And from many key places around the United States, the South Atlantic, the Western Hemisphere is where it's at. A couple of other things. I won't say anything about trade because we said a lot about that, but on energy, I would just underscore the fact that we're not only looking at what people are describing as a shale gas revolution in the United States, but what is in fact actually an Atlantic energy revolution. And already over 30% of world supply is coming from Atlantic sources. This is only going to grow with certain things that could happen, including in Mexico, with deregulation and so on. It could grow even more rapidly. This is going to make a big difference in terms of the way the United States sees the world, including places like the Middle East, which was not on our agenda today. Again, it's very Atlantic. Geopolitics and security. A lot could be said. One of the great virtues, I think, of the South Atlantic space, Southern Atlantic space, is it doesn't have the animating big existential conflicts that you find elsewhere in the world. But it doesn't mean that security issues are off the agenda. There are lots of them between the United States and Mexico. I was in Mexico City last week, and many of our interlocutors told us over and over again, yes, we have a problem with violence in Mexico, but also be aware that 90% of the weapons that we seize in Mexico come from legal sales in the United States. So it's a mobility agenda with Mexico, but it's also a security agenda. And even Mali, I mean, this reaches, the implications of this clearly reach to the Atlantic coast of Africa. There's a debate about the exact numbers, but many specialists will now tell you that a very large percentage of the drugs trafficked into Europe now come across the South Atlantic rather than directly. And this is having a very real effect on security in West Africa and the Sahel and North Africa. Second point I'd make is that a bit of this interest over the next decade is likely to come from a desire to reinvigorate the transatlantic relationship itself. There was a time, going back centuries, and this is pointed out very well in the paper that was prepared for us, that the South Atlantic was the center of gravity in the Atlantic. I mean, this hasn't been so for centuries. We could have a pivot, again, if I can use that term, to something that is, if not exactly putting the center of gravity in the south, at least it's a rebalancing between north and south. What is the American interest here? Well, I think there's an intellectual and policy interest, first of all, in big up-and-coming places. I mean, Brazil has been at the forefront of this debate. How do you engage Brazil? It's not so easy for the United States. It's not so easy for Europe. In fact, I think it's not so easy as part of the Brazilian debate to put this Atlantic piece at the center. But it could happen. And it might be one way of engaging with Brazil. Mexico. Mexico is another very interesting case for this. Is it possible, and it's just an open question, to achieve something that is a little more strategic, a little bigger than just the border engagement with Mexico for the United States, if we put this Atlantic component into it and common interests in the Atlantic? Maybe. It's worth thinking about. Let me just make a final point, even more global, which is that we shouldn't forget about the rise of Asia in relation to this. First, for two reasons. First of all, this anxiety about the rise of Asia is clearly driving a lot of the American and European interest in searching for something new in the transatlantic relationship. I do think there is a sense in which a transatlantic relationship that is just operating on a Washington-Brussels axis, if I can put it that way, isn't firing on all of its cylinders. And something more would be useful, and that something more is likely to come from the two-thirds of the space that hasn't been part of the transatlantic relationship for the last decades. So I think there is that piece of it, the kind of broad gauge notion about power and changing balances and so forth. But the other piece of it is simply that China and India and other actors are simply going to be doing more in the Atlantic. And we need to understand what that is together. Some of it may be very beneficial, some of it less so. But we need to understand what that competition is, and I think it's going to be a shared trilateral interest between the United States, the Atlantic, well, South America, Latin America, and Atlantic Africa with the United States and Europe in understanding this new geometry, especially about what China is going to do. So over the next decade, I think I'm actually quite optimistic that this is going to be more prominent in the American debate. No one is going to go out and label it as a kind of pivot to the South Atlantic, but I think a rebalancing probably is in the cards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hin. And I'm sorry for pressing a little bit, but our time is very limited. And now our last member of the panel is João Marques de Almeida, please, who is now in a private partnership, but
Yes.
before he was at the BEPA, at the policy advisor.
I'm still more privileged than my friend Christian because I'm an ex-bureaucratic, which means it's a very good position, you know. I'm still enjoying the freedom that I recently acquired, so I will be quite actually free in my comments. And I will start by saying that there is something that strikes me if I look at the list of participants in a discussion on South Atlantic and wider Atlantic area, that there is no Brazilian. I didn't organize this discussion. I don't know the reasons why there are no Brazilians here in the list of participants. But I worked, especially the last 3 years, very intensively on Brazil and on the transatlantic relations at the European Commission. I organized some meetings like these, and I know how difficult it is to get Brazilians to come to these meetings. Now, I'm from Portugal, I'm Portuguese. I don't pretend to speak on behalf of the Brazilians, you know, I'm sure they wouldn't like me to do that. But I did some work on Brazil during the last couple of years. I had many discussions with Brazilians. I helped to prepare some summits with Brazil. And I can tell you two things. First, I don't think we'll have a very ambitious, wider Atlantic agenda if we don't convince Brazil to be part of it. And secondly, I'm very sure that it will be very difficult to convince the Brazilians to be part of it. I think we can convince the Brazilians, but it won't be easy. This is what my experience tells me of working with Brazilians during the last 3 years, especially. And if you look at Brazil, they look at foreign policy. Let me just tell you some 3 or 4 basic ideas that explain the way Brazil looks at global politics today. First, they very much welcome the multipolar world. They love the world of rising BRICS. They love to be a rising power. And they see themselves as being a rising power against, like all rising powers, declining powers. And it happens that those declining powers for Brazilians are Europeans and North Americans. So they are in a different position, structural position. So they see somehow the rising powers competing for a place in the sun against the traditional dominant powers that happens to be Northern Atlantic countries and powers. Secondly, they want to keep in their foreign policy as much autonomy as they can. They want to have good relations with everybody. You know, in a striking similarity to the United States and to France, Brazil sees themselves as an exceptional country with an exceptional history, with an exceptional destiny, and with an exceptional role to play in the world. It's quite amazing if you go to Brazil the way you perceive and you understand this. So they don't want to have special relations with anybody, and they want to have good relations with everybody, to keep as much autonomy as they can in their foreign policy. Thirdly, now, at this moment, they see the biggest economic opportunities coming from Asia, not from the Atlantic area. They see some economic opportunities in Africa, but especially they know that their economic growth is linked to the economic growth of China and India above all. And that's the opportunities they want to take. And fourthly, actually, and this is very interesting to hear the Mexican ambassador to the United Nations, Brazil has almost an opposite position to Mexico. Brazil wants to rebalance the North and the South Atlantic, but does not want to really work to further integration between the North and the South Atlantic. Brazil is actually quite happy with certain division and distinction between the South and the North Atlantic, because Brazil see themselves as the dominant Southern Atlantic power, both in South America and in Africa, and they want to keep it as it is. I remember once I was in Brazil and we were in a seminar like this, we were discussing European-Brazilian cooperation in Africa. And the former diplomat from Brazil told me very frankly, why should we want to go with Europeans to Africa? Nobody likes you in Africa and everybody likes us. Of course, the Brazilians are open to this kind of fantasies sometimes, but that's the way they think. That's the way many people in Brazil think today, and I think we'll need lots of work and persuasion. I think we can do it, but we'll need really lots of work, lots of persuasion and time to convince Brazilians that they can really benefit from further integration in the Atlantic, from further cooperation with both Europe and North America, and especially this may happen if one day they will be obliged to take positions and to make choices. Let me just finalize with this. It's a bit simplistic, but a comparison. Brazil will be to this wider Atlantic agenda what France has been to the transatlantic relationship in the last 4 or 5 decades. The Gaullist country in the wider Atlantic that we cannot live without them, and we'll have to work hard to convince them of the merits of this.
But sometimes France has been very useful in Atlantic relations, so we shouldn't lose we shouldn't lose all our hope. So, is there someone who wants to intervene, please? Very short, because we are
yes,
really
I will
at the
be
end.
extremely short. Pasquale Salzano from Eni. I would like to comment very, very quickly on what Mr. Lesser said about energy and the energy revolution in the US. Actually, of course, the shale gas and conventional gas is implying a real revolution worldwide. But maybe we should ask, what is the real revolution? Because in the US, of course, they have the technology, they have the social and regulatory framework to go ahead with this new technology for extraction of shale gas. But is it really true that we are going to have the same worldwide? Maybe not. So the real point on possible geopolitical implications is whether the US is going or not to export the shale gas that they have in the US. Why? Because this can have implications, domestic implication in the US, and of course external implication. Domestic implication because the price of gas now is very cheap, extremely cheap in the US. So this means that for the US companies, the competitive advantage is becoming very, very interesting. And of course, this is kind of a new industrialization of the US. So new investments are coming to the US because the cost of energy is going lower and lower. If they are going to export the shale gas, this can cause a rise of the price in the US. So maybe this is not a good time to do that. But, and this is my final point, is it true that US, they are becoming independent, let's say, from an energetic point of view, will not be engaged anymore in worldwide? I don't think so, because we should not speak about independence, but self-sufficiency, because of course the US it's linked to the economy worldwide. So even though they can become self-sufficient from the energy point of view, the link with the world economy will keep them engaged worldwide as well. Thank you.
Thank you. A short point by him, Lesser, on this point.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to answer on this because I apologize in advance. I have to go to another event. This is a very good point. I mean, it's a very complex phenomenon. What's sometimes glibly referred to just as a shale gas revolution is a very complicated phenomenon, and it has a lot of implications that go beyond just our domestic production. If I were to guess, I think probably we will become an exporter over time of gas. But I would, so that would be my point on that. I think on the question of whether that will translate into less U.S. interest in the Middle East, for example, which is what this is code for, no, I don't think so. I think there are other drivers of that. It was never correct to say it was all about energy in any case. And we'll still be interested in the stability of markets from the Gulf and so on. So, yeah, I mean, I share your perspective, I think. Thanks.
Okay, Mr. Leffler.
Thank you. Just a few comments. Previously, I said you had to listen to a bureaucrat. Now, I risk even being the complacent bureaucrat. I think, I mean, I talked before of the strength of the transatlantic, North Atlantic relationship as a starting point for what we're trying to achieve there. Some people have expressed concern or even dismissiveness about the relationship between the EU and Latin America. I think that's wrong. That is also a remarkably strong relationship. Just one piece of statistics, which is that the stock of European investments in Latin America is bigger than the stock of European investments in Russia, China, India, and South Africa together. So we have a strong basis to build on there. Europe is big in Latin America. They are also important for the European economy. There is, by the way, already what I would call a TAFTA effect. When we were in South America a week, 10 days ago, for the EU Latin America Caribbean Summit, it was remarkable how many countries, including Brazil, openly expressed a degree of nervousness about being left behind by the EU-US trade deal. I think that's one of the reasons that the Mercosur countries have now said, again, they want to re-engage in that negotiation. I think the challenge we face is squaring the triangle. We talk of the transatlantic space and redefining it. We've been talking mostly about Europe, North America, and Latin America. There's the Africa dimension that is the real challenge. It is much more varied. It is much more divided on the Atlantic front. There are some countries, notably Morocco, that have made a very clear choice of engagement, free trade with the United States, free trade with Europe, the opportunities that arise out of that, just as that has offered new opportunities to Mexico. One of the ways forward was mentioned briefly here in terms of also them finding a way into the mosaic of Africa, which is the 2015 exercise of turning the MDGs into something else. Possibly people talk of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and how we can build on that. We've got the Atlantic energy issues. We've got the dark side of the Atlantic, the security quadrangle, with the flows of illicit funds and of drugs across all four corners of the Atlantic. So there are several elements we can build on there. One last more curiosity point is a benefit, an advantage we have here is that the Atlantic is actually quite small. It's a lot smaller than the Pacific. We had this summit between the EU and Latin America and the Caribbean in Santiago de Chile. That's the furthest you can go from Europe anywhere in Latin America. That is still a shorter flight than from Santiago to anywhere in Asia.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Now, I have a short reaction by our introducer, by Mr. Pezzini. Dr. Pezzini, please, very shortly. I don't know if the other panelists want to say very small things.
I'll be extremely short. If there are differences in the level of macroeconomic management across the Atlantic, one of these differences that Latin American countries have learned from the crisis that they had to pass through, and in part the performance is as the result of better macroeconomic policies, differentiation of trade, and third, the fact that there is a growing internal demand. They are confronted, therefore, with a very complicated situation now, including dealing with the liquidity that is coming from the northern part of the Atlantic. Therefore, I would suggest not to caricaturize too much the situation in Latin American countries. In many cases, we are facing real different interests. And therefore, it's not just a matter of misunderstanding. It's also a matter of the fact that there are different answers to the crisis, and the answer that Brazil, Argentina, Chile are giving at the crisis is not the same that is given by Northern Atlantic, that by chance is also different in East or West. As such, I would suggest that a more careful analysis of the different interests in play is crucial. We cannot pretend Brazil to open immediately its markets when we are in a phase of reception. There are obviously conflicting interests there. So probably the basis of a negotiation needs to be more articulated.
Thank you. Ambassador D'Alba.
Thank you very much. A very quick word, but something that explains the different approaches from not only Brazil, but other countries. I would include particularly China, India, even South Africa, is that we have a quite different understanding of a fundamental principle, which is the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and capabilities. Mexico has argued that there is no country without responsibility, and there is no country without responsibility and capability. We all have certain responsibility and certain capabilities, but we need Europe, we need the developed world to take this in a very serious manner, because the issue of equity becomes the central issue. It's not just to tear down the wall between developed and developing countries, it's whether we all assume our responsibilities, and that is far from being clear when it comes to some of the global problems and the response of developed countries to those global crises. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Bouyou.
Well, I just want to recall my very good friend, João. When Delfinetto was Minister of Economy and Finance in Brazil, was very much oriented to Atlantic and to North Atlantic, heavily indebted, social tensions, upheaval. Brazil was very Atlantic. Well, of course, if we look at the figure in the last 3-4 years, yes, they could remain a little bit far from being in a position to put priority on Atlantic. The last situation we can read as far as macroeconomics of Brazil are concerned is not so good. I'm afraid Brazil will become more Atlantic than these 2 days. And it's always the same functioning system of trade-offs, negotiations. The only difference is that the changes are expedited by the macroeconomic factors and macro geopolitical factors. And at the end of the day, there is room for consensus and agreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I should conclude, but of course, there is very little to say. It is clear that there is a difference between the first part of our discussion and the second part of our discussion. In both cases, we are speaking of a necessary political and economic initiative. In the first case, however, let's say the ground has been prepared, even if the difficulties are very high. In the second case, the ground has to be yet fully prepared, and the difficulties remain high, even in this situation. However, what I would like to underline is that there is a degree of voluntarism in a way. We have to show why we want to have this kind of approach. And the why, in my opinion, is more or less the same why we started the European adventure, if you want, or integration, and that is the problem of peace and global governance. The question is that we have to ensure a new kind of global governance if we want to maintain peace. If I look at the last production of scenarios by the National Intelligence Council of the United States on the various possibilities of the future, the most positive scenario, that they call fusion, is the one in which the policies of the United States and China work together. This is the most unlikely scenario, in fact. The United States and China may be in agreement from time to time, but they will not become the new joint engine for peace and for many years to come. While if we look at the Atlantic, this is possible. The problem is if we want it and if we can organize it. So the question is, that to convince the various partners that if we are interested in peace and in development of a new global governance, which will increase, of course also wealth and development, well, maybe we have to go in a direction of greater integration, and so I'm not speaking of a federation of the Atlantic, but I'm speaking of a greater integration of the various policies. If, on the contrary, we fail this kind of thing, and we continue to fail on all our projects of greater cooperation, then probably this scenario is a scenario of conflict and war. And in a scenario of conflict and war, of course, the problem of growth will become secondary, and the problem of survival will become much more important and much more difficult to ensure. On this very optimistic note, I will say, first of all, I will convey to you the excuse of the Deputy Minister Marta Dassou, because she had another engagement and she couldn't stay up to the end. So she was very sorry, and she asked me to convey her excuse. And I will thank you all for your participation, especially those who have stayed until the end, and who will receive a special medal at the end of the thing. And I will. This was a first for us, a first attempt to try to explore the issue. We will continue on this effort, and I hope that we will continue with you and with further and even better discussion. This one, in any way, was, in my opinion, quite good. Thank you very much indeed.